The clinking of crystal flutes echoed through the living room, drowned out by the heavy scent of designer perfume and roasted garlic. I stayed retreated in the shadowed corner near the balcony windows, pressing my shoulder blades flat against the cold plaster wall. From this vantage point, my blind spots were entirely covered, and I maintained a clear line of sight on every moving target in the room. Just 5 paces away, a tight cluster of my sister's friends gathered, deliberately raising their high-pitched voices over the jazz music so I would hear every word. A woman in a tight dress sneered openly, pointing out how out of place I looked standing near the curtains. Another woman, weighed down by heavy gold jewelry, let out a mocking laugh as she labeled me a failure. They openly shared the rumors they had been fed, casually calling me a coward who had been kicked out of the military after abandoning my squad in the dirt. I lifted a plastic cup of lukewarm tap water to my dry lips, swallowing quietly while keeping my posture rigidly controlled. I felt no urge to defend myself against cheap gossip. My sister, Laurel, glided over to join them, her silk dress brushing against the mud-stained toe of my tactical boot. She held her champagne glass high, strategically positioning her left hand so the overhead chandeliers would ignite the massive diamond ring on her finger. Instead of shutting down the vicious lies about her own flesh and blood, Laurel put on a performance of tragic sorrow. She sighed heavily, begging her friends to go easy on me because our family had supposedly tried everything to help my broken, selfish nature. The women around her gasped in rehearsed pity, patting Laurel on the back for being such a generous and long-suffering sibling. I set my cup down on the wooden sill, my knuckles turning white as my fingers dug into the edge of the wood. The diamond shining on her hand had been bought with my stolen hazard pay, the exact funds I had wired home while pulling bleeding soldiers out of burning wreckage. She was wearing the direct proceeds of my survival while branding me a disgrace to clear her own conscience. My father, Arthur, strolled into the middle of the group, holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. He did not even bother to look in my direction as he introduced me to Laurel's fiancé, an active-duty military commander named Vance. Arthur flicked his wrist, gesturing toward me with his glass as if I were a permanent stain on his expensive rug. He told Vance not to pay me any mind, loudly declaring to the entire room that I was irresponsible trash who had been rightfully kicked to the curb by the armed forces. The sarcasm cut deep, but I maintained my military posture, holding my breath as Vance stepped forward. Vance did not smile or join in on the casual cruelty. He offered his hand politely, but the exact second his fingers grazed my skin, brushing against the raised, jagged scar running down my wrist, his entire frame locked up. His breath hitched sharply in his throat. His head snapped up, his dark eyes locking onto mine with intense recognition, realizing in a fraction of a second that the story he had been fed was a complete lie. To understand why a seasoned military commander froze in the middle of a crowded room, you have to rewind 48 hours to the moment my tires crunched onto the gravel driveway of my family's coastal home. After 6 years of continuous combat deployments, breathing dust, sweat, and copper, I finally killed the engine of my beat-up truck. The silence of the ocean fog felt suffocating. I stepped out onto the damp ground, grabbing my worn tactical bag from the passenger seat, ready to face the family I had not seen in years. Arthur was standing on the porch wearing a pristine cashmere sweater that cost more than a standard military rifle. There were no open arms, no warm greeting, and not a single step taken in my direction. His eyes did a slow, clinical sweep over my body, taking in the dried mud on my boots and the faded patches on my canvas jacket. He pointed a stiff finger toward the narrow, weed-choked path along the side of the house, ordering me to use the back door so I would not track dirt over the new carpets. I gripped the strap of my bag and walked around the perimeter of my childhood home, barred from the front door like a stray animal. When I pushed through the kitchen, the air smelled sharply of harsh bleach and roasting meat. Laurel was standing near the marble island in a cream-colored silk dress that draped perfectly over her frame. She stepped forward to give me a carefully calculated hug, keeping her shoulders pulled back to ensure her expensive outfit never actually touched my jacket. The instant she pulled away, her polite expression vanished, replaced by a harsh glare. She lowered her voice to a whisper, warning me not to bring up my bloody military stories around Vance's family. She demanded that I sit quietly in the corner, keep my mouth shut, and clear the dinner plates when everyone was finished eating. As she turned and walked away, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood, the light caught the massive ring on her finger. That diamond represented the exact sum of money I had sent home to cover medical expenses years ago. I carried my bag upstairs and pushed open the door to my old bedroom, only to find the space completely transformed. My parents had knocked down the drywall and gutted my childhood memories to build a massive walk-in closet for Laurel. Rows of luxury clothes hung where my bed and desk used to be, the familiar scent of old paper replaced by overwhelming perfume. As I kicked a shoebox out of the way to make room on the floor, the lid popped off, spilling a thick stack of old financial papers across the floorboards. I crouched down on the cold floor and picked up the top statement, scanning the faded black print. It was a joint savings account under my name and my father's, containing every dollar I had earned working double shifts at a diner before enlisting. The withdrawal column showed a complete drain down to zero, dated the exact week Laurel had thrown a fit demanding money to launch a failed boutique. My father had not just borrowed my savings, he had stolen my entire future to fund her endless delusions. A weak person would have run downstairs screaming, but a trained soldier assesses the situation and plans the counterstrike. I carefully folded the bank statement into a tight square, pressing the edges until my thumbs turned pale. I slid the paper deep into the chest pocket of my field jacket and pulled the metal zipper shut with a sharp snap. I took one last look at the shrine of luxury built on my stolen sacrifice, squared my shoulders, and headed downstairs just as the front doorbell rang. The formal dinner was set on a massive mahogany table covered in crisp white linen. Arthur sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, pouring wine and feeding Vance's parents a steady stream of exaggerated lies. Laurel and Vance occupied the seats of honor in the center, surrounded by silver platters and heavy crystal. Meanwhile, my assigned chair was shoved into the farthest corner of the room, so close to the kitchen door that the brass hinges brushed my shoulder whenever the staff walked by. Throughout the meal, Arthur dominated the conversation, bragging about how Laurel was a brilliant entrepreneur who never ran away from a challenge. My Uncle Greg, chewing with his mouth open, pointed his fork across the table and loudly asked if I was still drifting around after being kicked out of the service. The room fell silent as Laurel jumped in, putting on a tragic face while telling everyone I had abandoned my squad in the middle of a combat zone to save my own skin. I set my heavy steak knife down on the porcelain plate with a single, clear metallic clink that echoed across the quiet room. I did not raise my voice, yell, or offer a desperate defense, because a real professional never wastes ammunition on cheap decoys. Instead, I pulled my shoulders back, locked my spine straight, and stared directly at the wall behind my father with unbreakable composure. My absolute silence cut through their pathetic lies far more effectively than any screaming match ever could. While Vance's parents looked at me with polite disgust, Vance himself did not buy the narrative for a single second. The commander lowered his fork, his eyes shifting as he began a quiet tactical assessment of my posture. He noticed the rigid discipline in my breathing, the set of my jaw, and the heavy calluses on my hands built by years of handling combat gear. He knew that a coward who breaks under fire could never possess that level of cold, iron composure under social attack. Vance locked his jaw, recognizing the obvious discrepancy between the story he was being told and the person sitting in front of him. When my father tried to break the sudden tension by raising his glass for a booming toast to Laurel, Vance picked up his crystal glass but refused to drink. He stared directly down the length of the table, locking eyes with me across the room. We shared a silent, unspoken moment of understanding between two people who knew the true cost of service, and I knew the truth was about to surface. The next afternoon, gray coastal clouds swallowed the sky as cold Pacific winds whipped across the jagged cliffs behind the property. Laurel dragged Vance out to the edge of the bluffs to take photos before the evening engagement party, ordering me to follow along as her personal baggage handler. I maintained a steady distance of 30 paces behind them, carrying her heavy leather makeup bag while keeping a clear field of view over the terrain. Laurel stood inches from the edge, entirely absorbed in her phone screen while ignoring her fiancé. Vance looked bored and completely out of place in the freezing wind, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark coat. He turned his back on Laurel's endless posing and walked directly up the incline toward me, his heavy boots crushing the dry grass. He stopped right beside my shoulder, keeping his eyes fixed on the crashing waves below. In a low, gravelly voice, he asked if I had served a specific rotation overseas years ago, probing quietly to confirm a detail he had read in classified reports. I kept my tone completely flat and impenetrable, refusing to hand over my military history to someone marrying into my family's web of deception. Vance let out a dry, knowing exhale, realizing I was protecting my perimeter. Right at that moment, a sudden, violent gust of wind ripped across the cliff, catching the loose fabric of my jacket and hauling my sleeve past my elbow. My left wrist was exposed to the harsh light, revealing a thick, jagged scar torn deeply into the muscle. That mangled tissue was the permanent record of the night a concrete building collapsed in a war zone, where I used my bare hands to haul a heavy winch cable through burning debris to pull 6 trapped soldiers to safety. Vance's eyes snapped down to my wrist, his breath catching in his chest as he instantly recognized the specific damage left by steel rescue cables. Before I could pull my sleeve back down, an older relative trudging up the hill loudly complained about my father hiding my actual combat medals in the attic just to keep from overshadowing Laurel. The heavy silence that followed was absolute, and Laurel turned around with a look of pure, unfiltered panic on her face. Vance stood completely still on the grass, slowly turning his gaze from the scar on my arm to the terrified expression on my sister's face. The entire wall of lies my family had constructed over a decade crumbled into dust inside the commander's mind. He saw the full picture clearly, realizing that the person they called a coward was the only true veteran in the room. Back at the engagement party, the tension reached its breaking point when Vance stared at my wrist in front of the entire crowd. The quiet realization washed over his face, replacing his polite demeanor with cold, lethal authority. He gently released my hand, turned away from me, and walked directly toward the center of the room where my father and Laurel were standing. The music seemed to fade as the guests noticed the sudden change in atmosphere, sensing that something heavy was about to drop. Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the very same bank statement I had left on the kitchen counter earlier that afternoon. He looked my father directly in the eye and asked him to explain why my combat hazard pay and life savings had been transferred into Laurel's business account years ago. The room went completely dead silent, the guests freezing in place as my father's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red while he stammered for a cover story. Laurel stepped forward, her voice trembling as she tried to brush it off as a simple family misunderstanding. But Vance held up his hand, cutting her off instantly with the sharp command of a seasoned officer. He looked at the expensive diamond ring on her finger, then at the jagged scar on my arm, stating plainly that he could never marry into a family that built their luxury by stealing from a real soldier and calling her a coward to cover their tracks. He slowly unbuttoned his coat, turned his back on them, and walked out of the house without looking back. My father stood frozen in the center of the room, ruined by his own greed, while Laurel burst into hysterical tears as her wealthy friends began quietly slipping out the front door. I stood by the window, watching the chaos unfold without feeling a single shred of anger or regret. I adjusted my jacket, zipped up my bag, and walked out the back door into the crisp, clean night air. Stepping onto the open road, I realized that true honor is something no lie can ever destroy, and I was finally free.